Hi, folks, and welcome to the last lecture of History 16. My apologies for being late in posting this. I'd meant to post it on Sunday, but I think maybe like a lot of you, this next week is kind of caught up on me. So my apologies, and you will now have your last lecture of the semester, your last chance to see me. So in our previous lecture, I talked a little bit about the period in our nation's history known as Reconstruction, right? This is the period after the Northern victory in the Civil War, where there is this tremendous debate over how to rebuild the South, right? White Southerners essentially want to get things back as close to the pre-Civil War period as possible. Slavery in all but name. A return to former Confederate elites to state houses and to Congress. And the then president Andrew Johnson, who took over following Lincoln's assassination, was perfectly willing to let that happen. Ultimately, however, the vision of civil rights and of Reconstruction that prevailed, at least for a time, was that of the so-called radical Republicans in Congress, right? The kind of abolitionist wing of the Republican Party, who were convinced that having won the war, the North should not then lose the peace by allowing the South to simply return to business as usual. So we got things like the Civil Rights Bills of 1866, which overturns the Black Codes. We got the 14th Amendment and its Equal Protection Clause, which writes into the Constitution itself guarantees of equal protection regardless of race. And we get also the 15th Amendment, which guarantees the right to vote regardless of race. Again, this does not go as far as perhaps it could have, right? It doesn't include gender as a protected category. That's gonna have to wait until we get to the 20th century. And I mentioned for you that it's not simply that Reconstruction and radical Reconstruction isn't simply a political event that's happening in Washington. It's also happening on the ground in the South. And as in the Civil War, freed men and women are essentially making their own history, right? They're not waiting for a law to be signed into practice. They are enacting their own version of Reconstruction. And that means reuniting with family units, right? That is an important goal of many of the freed men and women after emancipation is to reunite their families and to formalize relationships, marriages, adoptions. Education is hugely important for many of the freed men and women. The acquiring the ability to read and write, first and foremost, something that was forbidden under slavery. Getting access to land, right? That's obviously, as I talked about last time, challenging, but the sharecropping at least provides a temporary solution. And then, probably most dramatically, and this is where I ended for you last time, not simply the right to vote, which is something that's guaranteed by the 15th Amendment, but also but also serving in office, right? And I ended with this picture of the kind of dramatic changing face of, like you see on the left there, the state of Louisiana state legislature, right? And we have a lieutenant governor who is African American. We have many former slaves who are now serving in state houses and in Congress, right? Including somebody taking over Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy's old Senate seat. Now, the real question, however, is, does the North have the will to continue to ensure that Reconstruction is allowed to thrive in the South, right? That Reconstruction was not obviously popular with the white Southern elites who are used to running the political affairs of that section and were used to having a significant voice in the United States. Those white Southern elites were essentially told that, no, your time is over, right? That we are going to give equal rights and an equal voice, and that includes allowing Black people to vote. Reconstruction was in many ways a kind of idealistic attempt to remake the South and to remake this nation into something that comes closer to approaching the ideas of liberty and equality for all. It was also, frankly, the best hope for the South to recover, right? Aside from being the right thing to do morally and ethically to extend equal rights to formerly enslaved people, rebuilding the South was going to require the cooperation of all elements of that society. And so Reconstruction served moral and ethical imperatives. It also serves the imperative of rebuilding the South. But For the planters and rich white men like Jefferson Davis, who were accustomed to dominating the political and economic affairs of the South, the idea of Black men voting and holding office is not only offensive to their racial sensibilities, to their sense of white entitlement and white superiority, it's also a genuine threat to their political power. And most white elites in the South would have preferred that the South remain devastated and defeated rather than give up their own power and privilege and work on equal terms with Black Americans to rebuild the region. So, given the bitter opposition of Southern white elites, the former Confederate leadership, to Reconstruction, the fate of this experiment hinged essentially on two questions. First, how would poor Southern whites, right, those who had been the non-slaveholding majority, react to Reconstruction? Would they side with rich white elites, the former plantation owners, or would they side with the newly freed men and women? And second, how committed was the North and the federal government to enforcing the paper guarantees of equality that are enshrined in the various laws and constitutional amendments that went into making radical Reconstruction, right? A promise on paper is only as good as your will to enforce it. Now, the old white elite in the South was absolutely terrified, not only of Black people taking power, but also that poor whites would choose to pursue their common class interest with poor Blacks, right? In terms of their economic status, poor whites have more in common with the newly freed men and women than they do with the former lords and ladies of the plantation. Right? If you just identify economically, poor whites and poor Blacks have more in common with each other than they do with rich. Either one of them has in common with rich white men. Um, to prevent any kind of, or forestall any kind of a Black-white alliance along class lines, Southern elites um, play the race card, essentially, right? And they play on old stereotypes and fears about Blacks, and particularly about Black men, as kind of vicious, animalistic creatures. And they say poor white Southerners, like, if we allow Black people to take over the state, white people are in danger. And white Southern elites make an appeal to racial identity and racial solidarity, to this notion of a Herrenvolk democracy, right? This is the same appeal they had made in the antebellum period. They renew this appeal of no, race is what matters, right? And you live in this country, you probably you understand just by breathing the oxygen we all share, the potential power of appeals based on race and on a kind of privilege that comes with it. It's not self-evident though, right? It's not self-evident that poor whites would necessarily identify more strongly with rich whites who might be oppressing them as well as Black people, rather than identifying with people who have a common economic interest. This is a powerful force, though, right? We have generations of this notion of skin color is what matters, and so it's a fairly effective appeal by white Southern elites to play this notion of skin is what matters, right? And we need to band together. Us white people need to band together to protect ourselves against the threat of Black rule. We use harsher terms than that. Um, when persuasion doesn't work, however, other methods are employed, and probably the most prominent one of those, the one you may have heard of, is the Ku Klux Klan. Right, Klan is founded in Tennessee in 1865, and it grew rapidly with the advent of radical Reconstruction. The Klan was quite simply a domestic terrorist organization aimed at restoring and reinforcing white supremacy in the South. This kind of low-level vigilante violence against the freed men and women had been endemic since 1865, but the advent of radical Reconstruction helped to institutionalize it in the form of groups like the Klan. So what was the Klan about, other than these goofy get-ups? And I do want to talk about the goofy get-ups in a minute. Part of the goal of the Klan is to intimidate African Americans and prevent them from exercising their newly won constitutional rights through fear, terror, and intimidation, right? And so, come election day, the 15th Amendment may say you have a right to vote, but there's a bunch of armed white guys with guns outside the polling place, and you're a Black man and you roll up on that polling place ready to vote. They're going to say, hey, the 15th Amendment, whatever, dude, I'm the one with a gun. You go home. you go home. You don't vote, right? You don't make trouble. You don't try to speak up for your rights, whether it's the right to vote or to have a job or whatever. Armed terrorism aimed at discouraging freed Black men and women from pursuing the promises of Reconstruction. So that's obviously a huge part of what's going on with the Klan. There's also something else going on with the Klan, though, because the Klan is also about reinforcing notions of shared white identity that cut across class lines and to address this sort of fear, right? So, um, the Klan, if you think about it, is kind of fucking stupid. Like, I mean, not just because it's racist, obviously, but like, even if you don't know what they stand for, right? Like, look at this fucking outfit. Look what this person is wearing. They put it on their horse, right? Um, and the kind of standard reason, oh, why do you wear all this garb and stuff is, oh, it's because to protect your identity, right? Well, that's actually not necessary. In the white Southern towns where the Klan is active, everybody knows who's in the Klan. And the sheriff is either in the Klan or sympathetic to the Klan. The white sheriff is not going to prosecute these people. You don't need to protect your identity, and you certainly don't need to protect your horse's identity. But look at this thing, right? And then they not only have this goofy uniform, they have these dumb titles, right? You're reading some stuff about the various titles and bylaws and all that, and Grand Wizard and all of that. Why do you have this, right? What's the purpose of all of this? Well, a lot of this is about creating a kind of shared culture and identity around whiteness, and by doing it through uniforms and titles, right? Uniforms, even goofy ones like this, serve a purpose, right? So, this is an old slide. For those of you who know the 49ers maybe recognize the players and know it's an old slide. I haven't changed it or updated it because I'm old, and I don't follow the Niners anymore for a variety of reasons. I don't follow football anymore. But I like this slide because it illustrates part of what I'm getting at here. You see two people here. On your right, Patrick Willis, All Pro, he's going to be Hall of Fame linebacker. Just an absolute, just world-class football player and a very big dude, right? To your left, Andy Lee. Andy Lee is a punter. Andy Lee's tiny. I could take Andy Lee in a fight. I mean, okay, I couldn't, but maybe some of you could, right? You can't imagine two more different guys than this, just physically. Their job description, what they do. Andy Lee goes out once every, 12 downs or whatever and kicks a ball and sits on the bench. Patrick Willis is in the trenches there rushing the quarterback. Just they look different. They have different jobs. If you saw them on the street, without their uniforms, you wouldn't say these two people work together. But what do they have in common? Well, they wear this uniform. They both wear, which is also, if you think about it objectively, a kind of silly uniform. They're wearing tights. But they wear this uniform to signify what? To signify that no matter what our differences are, whether they be, whatever the differences are between us, we're on the same team, right? We are on the same team. And that's what that uniform is for. Here's another example, right? Robert on the left, General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Union Army in Northern Virginia, and eventual president. On the right, an escaped enslaved person whose name we don't even know, who is serving as a kind of drummer boy in the Union Army. Right? Again, it's hard to imagine two more different people, right? One is the most going to become the president. He's the leader of the Union Army. Two is essentially an anonymous rank and file soldier, right? And yet, what do they have in common? They wear the same uniform. It signifies that they fight for the same cause, right? And that's in some ways what the Klan is about. It's about that as an organization, and that extends down to the uniforms, right? Under that goofy ass hood, one of these people might be a rich, wealthy former plantation owner, and one of them might be a dirt poor farmer, right? Who doesn't even own, doesn't have a dog, a pickup truck, a wife, or a farm, nothing, right? Dirt poor. What do we have in common? We have in common our white skin, and we have a common a membership in this organization where we all dress up in these uniforms to assert the superiority of whiteness and enact that through violence if necessary. Right? So this is an aspect of the Klan that I think doesn't get as much attention as it should, and of similar groups both then and today, right? Part of it is about terrorism directed against their enemies, in this case, Black people and their white allies. But it's also about asserting and constantly ritualizing the importance of white identity, which is not something that certainly elite, rich white Southerners didn't take that for granted. They understood that economically, poor white people were better off aligned with Black people. And so they felt the need to reinforce these bonds of race as being important. So, between the fact that many Southern whites were sympathetic to this notion of white supremacy even without the Klan, and the fact that those who weren't could often be coerced into it by terrorism necessary. The kind of biggest question facing Reconstruction is, will the North have the political will to enforce Reconstruction, to make sure those paper guarantees of equality translated into something real? At the very basic level, federal troops are necessary to check the Klan, since many local police forces in the South were themselves either directly involved with the Klan or at the very least turned a blind eye, right? On a kind of more mundane level, you need federal power to ensure that elections are being held fairly and that local officials did not, devise various schemes to prevent Black people from voting. Essentially, what we're looking at here in the South is an exercise in nation building and democratization that was going to require a substantial political and economic investment from the North, right? Not just going to happen. You're going to have to exercise continual political and sometimes military power to ensure that Reconstruction happens. And at first, the federal government, under the leadership of the radical Republicans, seemed willing to pay that price, right? So in April of 1871, we get the Ku Klux Klan Act, which gave President Grant, and then Ulysses S. Grant, the ability to use federal power, including the U.S. Army, to disrupt the KKK. And they do effectively do that. They have effectively destroyed the Klan as an organization by 1872. The Klan, as we know, will later have a rebirth. But this is an example of how, Reconstruction is hard. Reconstructing a society along democratic lines after centuries of slavery is hard. It's not impossible. You have to have the will to do it. However, by the mid 1870s, that will in the North and in the federal government was increasingly lacking. Part of it had to do with sort of simple fatigue. It was hard for many in the North, particularly white Northerners who aren't living in the South, who don't have a kind of direct stake in Reconstruction. It's only abstract. It's hard for them, many of them, ultimately to manage the kind of attention and willpower over the long period of time necessary to make this happen. Particularly in a period when racism is still endemic in the North, right? There's still lots of racism in the North. We talk a lot about the South as a sort of bastion of racism, and it is true that the South, where the institution of racism takes its most kind of formal form, whether that's slavery or Jim Crow segregation. There's plenty of racism in the North. There's plenty of racism in the West. And it's a big ask for many white Northerners who themselves do not necessarily believe in racial equality to continue spending money and time and effort to prop up Reconstruction in the South. More practically, there are changes taking place in the North itself. Put me in this chair. There are changes taking place within the North itself that we can support for Reconstruction. One of the things that was happening in the North in the 1870s was a huge boom in manufacturing and new forms of industrial organization. The completion of the transcontinental railroads, or the start, at least, of the transcontinental railroads, the tremendous growth of American industry, to the point that by 1873, the United States is second only to Great Britain in manufacturing production and the number of sort of workers that are the percentage of workers that are in factories. And while all this is going on, while the North is industrializing, Northern Republicans, the Republican Party of the North, is increasingly moving away from their roots in free soil and emancipation towards an increasingly close relationship with big business and industrial capitalism. Many Republican politicians sort of looked around and said, emancipation, well, we did that. Civil rights, Reconstruction, all of that, sure, but does it pay? Because these guys, all these big businesses, these huge industries, they pay, right? There's a lot of money flowing around in the North, and campaign contributions or otherwise. And that's lucrative. Reconstruction is a drain on your time and energy and on the nation's finances. Whereas, hey, I could spend more time dealing with these big business folks, and they're going to give me a big check at the end of the day. The waning Northern support for Reconstruction was dealt another blow in 1873. This is a depression, an economic depression, that had its origins in the massive boom of railroad building in the aftermath of the Civil War. And actually, it began during the war itself and accelerated in its aftermath, and millions of dollars are being poured into railroads. Um, Many of which, as you see in any kind of boom time, right? Everyone's opening a railroad, right? Railroads are popular. Everyone is opening them, and many of these are either poorly run or sort of shell companies whose sole purpose is to separate suckers from their money. Um, and so we have a kind of railroad bubble that pops, that crashes in 1873, and it leads to a widespread economic crisis that lasts for over 5 years. And as you see here, by 1876, half of the nation's railroads were in bankruptcy. 100 banks have failed. Over 18,000 businesses have failed. And these kind of raw economic statistics also have human consequences, right? Unemployment rate gets to 15% nationwide, and that gets as high as 25% in New York City. Now, one of the results of this economic depression is to see a sharp increase in class tensions within the North, between those who own these railroads and factories, and those who work in them. We already saw the kind of roots of this when I talked about the Industrial Revolution and the market revolution, and how we're beginning to see over the course of the 19th century, the creation of a kind of semi-permanent working class with artisans who maybe had the ability to climb up that ladder and become middle class or even rich themselves, are being replaced by semi-skilled labor, folks who are not learning skills, who are easily replaceable, and essentially find themselves earning low wages, not earning any skills, and not even being able to pass along anything to their kids, right? Not only do you stay a factory worker all your life, as a result of the poor wages that you're paid, you can't save money to make a life for your kid, right? And so you see the creation increasingly of a permanent working class. These class tensions had been submerged a little bit by the economic boom that followed the end of the Civil War, right? In good economic times, there's enough money flowing into the northern industrial economy that the big capitalists can make their profits, and enough of it trickles down to wage laborers to at least tamp down these tensions, right? The underlying causes aren't going away, but in flush times, little cash here and there helps keep those tensions down. But when this depression hits in 1873, it shatters the relative peace and raised the specter of an open class war in the United States, and particularly in the North. And there's absolutely no more dramatic example of this than the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. So by 1877, the railroad industry represents a huge capital investment, something in the order of $5 billion in 1877 dollars, and close to maybe like 90 million in contemporary terms. These are giant monopolistic corporations that exercise tremendous, not just economic, but political power in the United States. There are entire regions of the country, particularly in the West, that are basically dominated or controlled by the railroads. Communities either flourished or disappeared at the whim of the railroad, and the railroad controls the entire towns, industries, and even states. And this is particularly true in the West, right? For railway workers, the job was both unpredictable and dangerous, right? Accidents are common. There's no real health and safety regulations, and the railroads are dangerous. Nor is there any social safety net or recourse if you got hurt on the job. The courts of the time ruled that anybody who worked for the railroad assumed the risk of getting hurt, and thus railway companies could not be held liable. So if you get your arm chopped off by a railroad car or whatever, too bad. That's your bad. I guess you can't work for the railroad anymore. Maybe the church will take care of you. And even if you don't get hurt, life for these workers is very unstable. Right? It's not unusual for railway workers to be unemployed and therefore unpaid for as many as 4 days of the week, right? They were essentially at-will employees. Like, hey, we need you, come. They're gig workers, essentially, right? In contemporary parlance. Like, when there's work, you get paid. When there's not work, you don't get paid. And so and also you need to be ready for work at all times, because when we call you, we'll call you once. And if you don't answer, we'll go to the next guy. And then you're out paying another day, right? There's very little stability. It's very hard to, the wages are relatively low, and it's hard to sort of plan for your life when you don't know when you're going to be working or not working. Now, again, I mentioned these companies are basically monopolies, and an example of how this works is on May 15th, 1877, representatives of all of the major railway companies met secretly in Chicago, and they agreed that they would divide the market up between them. Right? The sort of your Econ 1 model of markets is people compete, and sort of the best companies win. Well, in the real world, that oftentimes is undercut by things like this. If the companies say, hey, we could compete with each other, but then we all might lose, or there might be some winners and some losers. If we just sit down and make an agreement here, we'll divide this up, everyone wins. At least everyone owns a railroad wins. And so they all agreed secretly that they were going to announce this pay cut on July 1st, that everyone gets a 10% pay cut, right? And for many railway workers, this is the last straw, right? Things were already bad, and then they get this unilateral 10% pay cut, which is occurring in the midst of an ongoing economic depression, in which millions are already unemployed, and those who are working maybe $1 a day. On Tuesday, July 16th, 1877, we get the first response to this, and it's railway workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia, went out on strike. And they cut the rail line. They say, we're not working. We're not going to allow any trains to run until we get fair wages. The strike quickly spreads, right? Because railroads are nationwide. Railroads connect the nation, and these labor practices are nationwide. So this spread very quickly, spreads Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, San Francisco. Within a few days, we have 100,000 rail workers on strike. 2/3 of the nation's railroads are shut down. And then many other workers go out on strike as well, either in sympathy with the railway workers or because, they've got similar issues, and they say, now is the time for us to strike, right? The most practical demand of the strikers was for a restoration of the wage cut, of the wage cut. These folks were angry. They were angry at the wage cut. They were angry at years of mistreatment. For the most part, these are not folks who are looking for a revolution, right? And in general, the history of the U.S. labor movement is not one of revolution. It's not one of let's overthrow, for better or worse, right? Let's overthrow the state and create communism or even create socialism, right? It's mostly for most workers about bread and butter issues. It's about, hey, I want to get paid a fair wage. I want predictable working hours. It's just kind of bread and butter stuff, right? It's in many ways rather conservative. It's a set of demands. It's not hey, we workers are going to take over the railroads. It's hey, we're going to go on strike to get fair wages, to get maybe some vacation days, maybe to get better safety. It's about kind of bread and butter issues, right? They were sometimes radical in their tactics, right? Things like taking over the railroads, cutting rail lines. But their goals are in many ways quite conservative, right? Literally issues of bread and butter. We don't have enough to eat. You're not paying us enough so we can eat. And the strikers employ a variety of tactics to try to get their way. They obviously they refuse to show up for work, but in other cases, when the railways try to run the trains anyway, they get replacement or scab workers in. They'll do things like put soap on the tracks so that when a train tries to go up the hill, it just slides on back down, right? In the face of the strikers' resistance, railroad officials refused to arbitrate, refused to sit down at the bargaining table, and instead called on federal and state authorities to break the strike by force. These railway companies are hugely influential. They have a lot of political influence because they have a lot of money, right? They can say, hey, Mr. Politician, I gave you a lot of money in the last election. If you want a lot of money in the next election, you better do what I say. And in this case, that includes crushing the strikes and in the groups. And so rather than negotiating, the railway companies used their political connections to convince both state governors and the president of the United States, then Rutherford B. Hayes, to dispatch the army to clear out strikers and reopen the railways by force if necessary. I'll give you just one example. Probably the most dramatic example happens in Pittsburgh. On July 21st of 1877, about 600 National Guard troops armed with rifles and Gatling guns arrived at the outskirts of Pittsburgh and began marching on the railway yard where the striking workers had gathered and were halting train traffic. When the news came that the National Guard had arrived, a vast array of average residents of Pittsburgh, not just strikers, but many just other men, women, and children, were outraged. And they went to the rail depot where they joined in solidarity with the strikers. And as the troops approached the depot, they were greeted by yelling and hissing and booing. Go home, leave us alone, get out of here. And as the soldiers begin trying to push into this crowd, there's more and more yelling, and the soldiers fix their bayonets. They literally put the bayonets on their end of their rifles, and they advance into the crowd, and they actually stab some of the strikers, and then some of them fire. Right, and very quickly, all of these troops are firing into this crowd of men, women, and children. They're surging in all directions. There's people lying dead on the ground. And within a few minutes, we have 20 dead and 29 maimed or wounded just in this initial firing, which a grand jury investigation later labeled an action of, quote, unauthorized, willful, and wanton killing, which the inquest can call no other name than murder. And as word of this massacre spread through the city, thousands of more people come out into the streets. And by early evening, the sheer weight of angry crowds forced the National Guard to retreat. Right, the National Guard has guns, but they are so vastly outnumbered that they're forced to retreat. And they actually retreat into one of the buildings where locomotives were normally housed in the rail yards. Within 15 minutes, the angry crowd outside has broken every single window in the building. They've seized all of the soldiers' food and water. As night falls, soldiers are trapped in this building while the crowd outside is yelling at them. Meanwhile, the city itself is in tumult. There's looting. The crowd begins to set fire to the rail yard itself. It eventually envelops 39 buildings of the railroad. Something on the order of over 1,000 freight cars are burned. And only when there is essentially nothing left to burn at the rail yard does the crowd finally start to leave. And before they leave a little parting gift for the National Guard, who were still trapped in one of these buildings. They left rail cars filled with burning coal and gasoline, and then they run them down into the tracks. And essentially they have this huge flaming mess right next to the building where the National Guard is holed up. At dawn, the National Guard is essentially forced to go into full retreat and flee from Pittsburgh, with angry citizens throwing rocks and bricks at them all the ways. We see similar things happening in many other northern cities. Pittsburgh is the kind of most dramatic example of this, but this is an example of the kind of level of conflict brought upon by this strike, right? Not just a handful of strikers against the police or National Guard, but entire cities essentially mobilizing against federal and state authority. Not just because of a wage cut, but because of the kind of ensuing decades of increasing accumulation of wealth by a handful of people at the expense of the average working person. It takes the dispatch of federal troops in many cases, the U.S. Army, to sort of put these things down. The press at this point is in a pattern we're going to see become all too familiar. The press is very closely tied to the interest of big business, right? Again, these same railroad owners that can cut big checks to politicians can also cut them to the press, and so you get coverage of the strike like this. This is the Brooklyn Daily Eagle from July of 1877. It's not pleasant to think of men being mowed down by soldiers, but it'll be a much worse spectacle for the country to have a mob triumphant than to have the life blown out of men who refuse to recognize the right of every American to control his own liberty and his own property. This is the nearest approach we have yet had to communism in America. And if we are to be saved from the darker horrors of that system, our authorities must act with unmistakable vigor in the present emergency. And again, these are not communists, right? For better or worse. I'm a pinko communist. These are not communists. These are people who want better wages. And yet, here we have the press saying it's better to kill them if we have to than accede to these demands. The church was also not particularly sympathetic, right? Here we have Reverend Henry Ward Beecher declaring, is the working class oppressed? Yes, undoubtedly it is. But God has intended the great to be great and the little to be little. I do not say that $1 a day is enough to support a man and 5 children if he insists on smoking and drinking beer. But the man who cannot live on bread and water alone is not fit, right? Basically saying these working class wretches, they're all spending their money on beer. They should just be content with living on bread and water, right? Um, in the face of this kind of coordinated opposition from the press, from the church, from the government, the strike eventually collapses, and the strikers failed to win a single one of their demands. The defeat of the strike, however, does not mean the end of labor strife in the United States. During the 1880s, 1890s, as you'll see, eventually in History 17, if you take that, the United States is frequently racked by violent labor unrest, far more violent than we see today, right? It pales in comparison to the kind of labor disputes we have today. The labor disputes of the 1890s and 1880s, 1890s were oftentimes open warfare in the streets of the American cities. And essentially what we're seeing here, right, is not simply a result of the Great Depression of 1877. It's a result of this longer term series of trends that we talked about, right? The greater concentration of wealth and distribution of wealth among a select few, and the tensions that produces with America's working classes. And that's a development that had its roots, going back to this shift to wage labor, going back to the market and industrial revolution. And we see these tensions play out earlier, right? The Astor Place riot. In part, it's about ethnicity, particularly kind of not nationality, right? The dispute between England and the United States, but it's also about class. It's about poor folks like one kind of Shakespeare, rich folks like another. And those tensions we see coming to the fore in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And although while this strike is broken by force, these tensions are not going to go away. And we're going to see them, if anything, intensify in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Now, this now loops back into our story of Reconstruction. Because we see, in the streets of the North, the federal government is using U.S. Army troops against the working class residents of northern cities. And as the North is tearing itself apart over the issue of class and labor, there's less and less interest or energy to enforce civil rights in the South, right? And as Northern energies and attentions begin to wane, conservative whites redeem, this is the word they use, redemption, state governments. And redemption essentially means overthrowing radical Reconstruction, a return to white supremacy and white rule in the South. Essentially the only thing that prevented this happening prior to this was the active intervention of the federal government. But with the North distracted, either by the wealth to be had in industrialization and, hey, let's focus on big business, or by the chaos unleashed by things like the Depression, there's just not a lot of political energy or will now to focus on the South. And so there's essentially an agreement among Northern politicians to let Southern whites run their own affairs, right? We're tired of having to constantly go in there and enforce Reconstruction. It's just easier for us to let Southern whites take back over. And Reconstruction effectively ends following the election of 1876. This is an election that pitted the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes against the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Now, Tilden narrowly wins the popular vote, but as we all know from recent history, popular vote doesn't determine who wins. And the electoral vote was running in favor of the Republican candidate, a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes. But there are three, as the election is concluding, there are 3 states where the results of the vote are disputed: South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. And the results of those states are disputed. It's not clear who won them. If and only if all 3 of those states are awarded to Rutherford B. Hayes, he would win. If any one of those states goes to Tilden, he wins. And what happens in the aftermath of this is one of the most cynical and shameful moments in American political history. Tilden and the Democrats agreed that they would concede the election, that they would let Tilden have all of those disputed states. But in return, Hayes and the Republican Party would have to agree to remove federal troops from the South and agree to no longer act to enforce Reconstruction or defend Black civil rights. Essentially, the Republican Party, in collusion with the Democrats, sells out the rights of Black people in the South in exchange for the presidency. Right? This is the so-called Compromise of 1877, the compromise among white elites, and the victim of that compromise are Black people in the South. This effectively ends Reconstruction. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist, puts it like this, and kind of summing up the ultimate abandonment and failure of Reconstruction. You say you have emancipated us. You have, and I thank you for it. But what is your emancipation? When the Israelites were emancipated, they were told to go and borrow of their neighbors, borrow their coin, borrow their jewels, load themselves down with the means of subsistence. After, they should go free in the land which the Lord God gave them. When the Russian serfs had their chains broken and given their liberty, the government of Russia, the despotic government of Russia, gave to those poor emancipated serfs a few acres of land on which they could live and earn their bread. But when you turned us loose, you gave us no acres. You turned us loose to the sky, to the storm, to the whirlwind, and worst of all, you turned us loose to the wrath of our infuriated masters. Right? So not only no 40 acres and a mule, but ultimately no even protection from their former masters, right? There is an attempt at it, right? This is not inevitable. It's not inevitable that we would go to segregation in the South, that we would go to the economic, political oppression and violence against Black people as kind of written into the fabric of Southern society. That wasn't inevitable, right? And there was this period from roughly 1866 to 1877 where the federal government used its power, imperfectly to be sure, but used its power to enforce civil rights. That ends in 1877, and it ends an experiment, a kind of idealist in biracial democracy, and founders on persistent racism, North and South, as well as on the internal divisions of the North. It's hard to miss the symbolism of federal troops that had been enforcing equal rights in the South, coming out of the South, just as another group of federal troops are being dispatched to put down labor unrest in the cities of the North. For Black men and women in the South, segregation and inequality enforced both by law and extra-legal terror in the form of lynching became the order of the day. It's not until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, almost 100 years later, that the white South is finally made to live up to the promises of equality under law that were supposedly contained in the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution. Meanwhile, in the North, politics, life, and society are shaped by increasingly violent conflicts between capital and labor, exemplified by the 1877 railroad strike. This is not probably the most optimistic or uplifting place where we could end the class, right? With the Klan, with the triumph of white supremacy and blood being shed in the streets of the North by American troops. But it gets at what I think is a very important point about American history, really about all history. And the kind of a standard narrative you often get in American history, maybe even in your high school classrooms, certainly you get it in kind of pop culture, is that we often present this story as one of continual progress towards the perfection of our republic. Sure, we weren't always perfect. We had slavery, we had racism, we had sexism and patriarchy and poverty. But slowly but surely, things have been getting better. And while our progress has not always been as speedy as we might have liked, that fundamentally the story of the United States is a story of progress towards freedom, equality, and the other idealistic promises enshrined in our foundational documents. Now, there might be a germ of truth to that idea, right? There has been undeniable progress in many areas of American life. Slavery is over. Jim Crow segregation is over. But to paint American society and to point to simply a story of progress is to miss a much more important and relevant point. I'll quote here. I'll give you here a quote from Martin Luther King on the kind of fallacy of this idea of time equals progress. This is coming from his letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963. And he's addressing his idea that the simple passing of time will bring progress. He says such an attitude stems from this tragic misconception of time, from the strangely irrational notion that there's something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. Now, King there is specifically addressing the United States in the era of the 1960s and the civil rights movement. But I think, a fundamental way to understand the history of this country is to see it not of one of inevitable progress, but a story of conflict over what kind of nation this is going to be. It's not just about slavery and freedom. It's about every aspect of American life: government, politics, the economy, culture, gender relations, class. All of this has been a sort of conflict from the beginning. Sometimes it's an abstract intellectual conflict, right? A debate between elites about federalism or anti-federalism. Sometimes it's a very concrete and real conflict, right? That's not abstract at all. Bacon's Rebellion, or pirates, or Ebenezer McIntosh, or pulling down the house of Thomas Hutchinson, or the Whiskey Rebellion, or the Astor Place riot, or the Civil War, or the railroad strike. These are all moments of conflict, many of which play out in the streets of American towns and cities. Some of which are violent, that shape what kind of nation this is going to become. And the results of these conflicts are seldom, if ever, inevitable, which is why I'm hesitant to I warn you against thinking about the history of this country either as being one of unending progress or necessarily being unending misery. I mean, you could look at the history of this country and say it's been fucked up from the beginning and it's still fucked up. I think there's a lot in that that's true. But it's not inevitable, right? And we have seen examples such as Reconstruction, or individual examples of brave people who have stood up and said, yeah, this is fucked up, and I'm going to do what I think is necessary to change it, right? Of people standing up to try to make this a country that lives up to its promises. And the sad fact is that the good guys don't always win, right? Sometimes the Ku Klux Klan wins. A lot of times, racism and white supremacy have won, right? That's certainly where we're ending this class. Either way, though, the outcome is seldom predetermined. Whatever your feelings on the existence and form of some sort of higher power, our earthly institutions, our government, our society, our economy, our culture, are the products of human beings. They were made by human beings, and they can be modified, changed, unmade, improved, or destroyed by human beings. And I guess that's where I'll make my sort of pitch for why all of this matters, why what happens in the classroom on the Zoom, I guess, matters, and why, more broadly, history as a way of knowing matters. Because on the one hand, history and understanding our collective history gives us an understanding of the importance of contingency. It shows us how individuals and groups have, through their actions, helped shape the destiny of this nation at critical moments. In doing so, it reminds us that the world we live in is susceptible to human agency, to being changed and to being remade, for good or for ill. History also does something else. It helps us grapple with the world as we have received it from those who have come before us. Because for all of the power of contingency, the fact is that no nation or society ever operates in a historical vacuum. The events of the past shape the world we live in both conscious and unconscious ways. Y'all know I'm a Penko commie, so of course I'm going to end with Karl Marx, right? Although I don't think you need to be a Marxist to agree with this sentiment. Marx said that people make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. What history can do for you is to help you understand the circumstances under which you live your life and make your own history. It can make you conscious of these dead generations and how their nightmares have shaped your life. It doesn't provide you an answer, right? History doesn't tell you what to do. Like someone would say, what is the lesson of history for X, Y, and Z? I would say, I don't fucking know. Okay, I wouldn't say that. I would say something more sophisticated than that because I have a PhD. I would say, well, it shows you this and that. And it could be this, could be that, right? And eventually I would make a judgment. But the judgment would be my judgment. It would be the judgment of history. It would be informed by my reading of history. And knowing history can tell you maybe how we got here and give you some ideas about how we might proceed. But what choices you ultimately make are your own. And your choices also have to compete with the choices of others and of this nightmare that we live in. But I do think history can be valuable for you, not simply to understand how we got here, but at least to understand how to begin to think about where we want to go. So that's pretty much it for History 16. Before I end, I will just sort of bring to your attention something that I mentioned on the very first day of lecture. It's at the top of your syllabus. I have this quote from an historian who was very important to me when I was training, a guy named William Appleman Williams, who said, "I'm not primarily interested in persuading you that I'm right. The object is to help you make your own sense out of our history." And that is really my approach, not just to this class, but to history. I have my opinions, right? I've not been shy about telling you that I am a pinko commie. I am the person Fox News warned you about. The point of this class, though, is not for you to agree or disagree with anything I say up here. The point is for you to understand what I'm saying while learning the tools you need to make your own judgments about the past, right? You need, this is a course you are taking. You need to understand what I'm saying, but you don't have to agree with it. And in the ideal world, you're developing the kind of tools of historical thinking and knowledge that will allow you to challenge the things I'm saying if you want to challenge them. And that's why what happens here on this lecture, Zoom, whatever fucking nightmare this is less than half of what you'll get out of this class. It's really in your discussion sections with your teaching assistants where you wrestle with historical documents, you write papers, and you begin to formulate your own arguments. And that's really where the learning in this class, most of the learning in this class takes place. I am in a certain sense that kind of circus sideshow here for your amusement, while the learning, the actual learning of the kind of skills you need, the building blocks you need to think and write like an historian, that takes place with your section. And so to the extent that this class has been successful, the credit really needs to go to our teaching assistants. I want to extend my thanks to all of our teaching assistants, to Bash and Andrew and Christy for their work. I hope you appreciate what they have done for you. You have teaching evaluations for this class that are now all online. We used to get to end class early so that you could fill out your evaluations. I guess we can end class whenever we want now since this is all on video. I'll ask in pondering your comments for if you want to write comments. It helps to be as specific and constructive as possible. Writing Malloy sucks. It may be cathartic for you, I don't know, but it's not going to help me improve this course for my teaching. It's also not the kind of comment that gets taken seriously by the administration. So, if there are things that specifically worked for you or specifically didn't work for you, being as specific as possible is helpful. I would be remiss by closing without sort of mentioning what's happening. Right, we are in the midst of another horrible COVID surge. It's been a semester like no other. It's been a 7-8 months like no other. This has been extraordinarily difficult. I am very privileged, right? I have a job. I don't have the Rona last I checked. I have a job. I have security. Many people don't. Many people are struggling with their health. They're struggling with employment. This is a hard time for a lot of people. And I know it's a hard time for a lot of you. And I applaud all of you for your efforts to make it through the semester, not just in this course, but elsewhere, under far from ideal circumstances. And this is not, I'll be honest, this is not the course I wanted to deliver, right? I fucking hate talking to a camera. I really enjoy this course. I like working with students. So to me, a lot of it, even with the lecture, it's The joy of being in the room, being able to see people and read your body language and tell when my points work and when they don't, or to talk with you before after class. We don't get to do that. And I do hope that I'll get to see some of you in person again when we're allowed to do that in another class, or hey, just drop by my office hours when that's a thing again. But I will wish you the best of luck as you complete the final exam for this course and the exams in your other courses. I wish you a safe and happy holidays. Fill out your evals. You fill your evals out. A safe and happy holidays. A great winter break. And I have nothing but admiration for all of you who are struggling to make the best of your education at this really incredibly difficult time when you're worried probably not just about yourself but your family. And uh, I only hope that I get to see you in person and maybe say that to your face sometime. All right. Good luck. Happy holidays. I hope to see you again sometime. Bye, folks.